with the neck, we're going to start getting into these structures called the anatomical triangles. Now, this is where kind of our raw memorization can start to happen. Or, depending on how you want to approach it, again, we do a little bit of math. We're getting 6 questions from all of this material. So the likelihood of getting a question from this specific chunk is low. It's not zero, it's low. But there's also only so much that they can ask about these structures. Most of the time, they like to connect it back either to the medical practice in general or to chiropractors in general and say, okay, what are the big structures found in these spaces, in these locations that chiropractors need to know, that they're going to see all of the time. So when we find these different spaces, they'll call them triangles, intervals, or spaces. We want to know the name, know the rough location, and know the most important contents. If you want to be 100% sure that you pass boards the first time, 100% drop all this into a Quizlet and memorize the crap out of it. But I'm telling you, you don't have to do that to do well on boards, okay? So the first one we'll talk about the submental triangle, also known as the suprahyoid triangle. We stop, we think, where is this? Break it down. Submental, sub meaning below. Mental, when we talk about the mental, we're referring to the chin. So it's going to be directly below the chin, but above the hyoid bone. So we see it right here. There's the chin, so below the chin, but above the hyoid, the submental triangle. The questions that you'll get asked about the triangles are either the boundaries or the contents of them. So the superior boundary is the mandible, the anterior belly of digastric is the lateral boundary, the hyoid bone is the inferior boundary. If they were going to ask a question about the boundaries, they're going to pick the anterior belly of digastric because it has an anterior and a posterior belly, and they can easily make a question including both parts of the digastric to try and trip you up. It doesn't contain a lot of important stuff, just some lymph nodes, some salivary glands, so nothing super exciting, so most likely not going to get a question on the contents. The next triangle is the submandibular triangle, aka the digastric triangle. So this is our special one. Why do it's called the digastric triangle? Because it involves the digastric muscle. We have the anterior and posterior belly of the digastric, being some of our borders, and then we have the mandible being our other border. This contains the submandibular gland, facial artery and vein, hypoglossal nerve, and then lymph nodes. Almost all the triangles contain lymph nodes, so don't worry too much about that. Biggest one here, we're going to look at the hypoglossal nerve, because this is a super important nerve. Because if we stop and think about the hypoglossal nerve, it does a lot of the innervation of the mouth, of the tongue, but it also goes and connects to the carotid body. If you remember, the carotid body is located at where the common carotid artery splits into the internal and external carotid down in the neck. And this nerve is going to go and innervate a specific chunk that's right there that gauges blood pressure going to the brain to make sure that the brain is getting enough blood pressure. So if this nerve gets damaged, our blood pressure sensing goes off the rails. So more than likely, that's going to be what we get asked about if we get asked about this triangle. The carotid triangle is next. You can see it right here. Again, we're talking about digastric, sternocleidomastoid, and then the omohyoid. Omohyoid, omo, like ombro meaning shoulder, hyoid being the hyoid bone, so it connects from the hyoid all the way to the shoulder. Main structure in the carotid triangle, what do we think that is? The carotid artery. It also contains the vagus nerve, Same thing as the hypoglossal nerve. The vagus nerve is responsible for monitoring blood pressure at the carotid body. So those are the two big important ones in the carotid triangle. Finally, the muscular triangle, also known as the inferior carotid triangle. This is most commonly the most asked of these specific set of triangles on boards. So if you're going to know all of the information about one of them, this is the one to remember all of the information about. So right here, we have the sternocleidomastoid, right here, this whole space. We have the hyoid up above, sternocleidomastoid, omohyoid, and then the midline of the neck makes up our medial lateral and lateral boundaries. The structure of note in this muscular triangle is the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. So this is in that muscular triangle. This is where we're going to palpate, we're going to feel, is there a goiter? Is there something else going on? All within this space. You can tell this is all kind of the anterior part of the neck. Getting more towards the back of the neck, we have two. We have an occipital triangle between the trapezius, the omohyoid, and the sternocleidomastoid. And then the supraclavicular triangle, aka subclavian triangle, aka omoclavicular triangle. We can see right down here below with the omohyoid, the clavicle down in there, sternocleidomastoid right here. Occipital triangle, very, very, very rarely ever asked, so nothing too crazy within there. The supraclavicular triangle, it contains part of the lung apex, which we jump into the pathology side of things. The lung apex is super important because it's related to a couple of conditions. Most commonly, the one that they ask about is the Pancoast tumor. Pancoast tumor is a tumor in the apex of the lung, and it gets so big and actually pushes onto the side of the vertebrae, and there are sympathetic chain ganglion located along the cervical vertebrae. So when it squeezes and it pushes that sympathetic chain ganglion, we get what's called Horner's syndrome. And the silly little phrase to remember what you see with Horner's syndrome is PAM is horny, PAM. We get ptosis, PTOSIS, which is that drooping of the eyelid. We get miosis, which is the pinpoint pupil. I'm going to double check, make sure that I say that. I always get those eye ones mixed up. Yeah, good. You get the smaller pupil, miosis. I was correct. It's always better to be safe than sorry. You get ptosis, you get miosis, and you get anhidrosis. And again, all of that will be covered again in the pathology section. So, anhidrosis means that you're not sweating from that side of your face. So, like the one side of your face will be sweating, and you have a distinct line straight down the center where you have no sweat on the other side because all of that is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. There's those two triangles. Additionally, we have the suboccipital triangle. You need to know everything there is to know about the suboccipital triangle. We talk about it again in the spinal anatomy section and really kind of dive into it over there. However, this is constantly asked about, in part because there's a lot of important structures in there. Most specifically, the vertebral artery. Chiropractors especially make a huge deal about the vertebral artery, so if there's anything involving the vertebral artery, they're going to ask questions about it because they're all terrified. Every chiropractor is terrified. I should say every academic chiropractor is terrified of the vertebral artery, it seems. Not me, but that's besides the point. The boundaries that we're going to see with the suboccipital triangle: superior and medial. We have the rectus, capitis, posterior major. Superior and lateral is the obliquus, capitis, superior. And inferior and lateral is the obliquus, capitis, inferior. It's super important to note these are the three muscles that make up the triangle. These three muscles. The question that you're going to get asked every single time is which of the muscles does not make up the suboccipital triangle? Which of the following muscles does not make up the suboccipital triangle? And they're going to try and get you by asking about for rectus, capitis, posterior, minor. That gets confusing. Major is part of the triangle. Minor is not part of the triangle. That's what we want to make sure that we know. This muscle, while it is an important structure and we need to know all about it, it is not part of the actual triangle itself. Another structure is the thyrocervical trunk. Again, not asked about very often, but the thyrocervical trunk contains the inferior thyroid artery, the suprascapular artery, and the transverse cervical artery. The mnemonic we have to remember this is TITS, the thyrocervical trunk, inferior thyroid artery, transverse cervical artery. Let me rearrange those. Transverse cervical artery and the suprascapular artery. Very, very rarely asked. If you're going to spend time memorizing stuff, don't do that here. Finish out this chunk. The suprahyoid muscles, we remember don't get stressed, mom. We have the digastric muscles, the anterior and posterior bellies. Anytime you have a muscle that is innervated by two different nerves, immediately we want to remember that muscle because that's a perfect muscle for asking questions on because they like to mess with you. So the digastric, the anterior is by the mylohyoid nerve, part of cranial nerve 5, division 3. This is cranial nerve to the trigeminal nerve. And then the posterior belly is the facial nerve. We have the mylohyoid, genohyoid, and stylohyoid as well. And I am going to rearrange these in order to match the mnemonic because it's more pleasing when everything lines up and matches. Don't get stressed, mom. There we go. Don't get stressed, mom. Those are the muscles, the suprahyoid muscles, the ones above. The way that they'll ask this type of question is, again, which of the following is not a suprahyoid muscle? And they'll give you one of the infrahyoid muscles thrown in there as a distractor. To remember our infrahyoid muscles, we talk about toss your hyoid. The thyrohyoid, omohyoid, sternohyoid, and sternothyroid. Let's remember ansa cervicalis. If you remember anatomy courses, they beat ansa cervicalis into you. Professors love ansa cervicalis when they talk about this whole chunk. They like to ask questions about it. Boards, all of the questions are written by essentially by professors. So you're going to get a question. You could very well see a question about ansa cervicalis. Here are muscles: the omohyoid, sternohyoid, thyrohyoid, and sternothyroid. And these muscles, they tell you exactly where they're going and where they're from and where they're going. Sternohyoid, sternum to hyoid. Omohyoid, shoulder to hyoid bone. Thyrohyoid, from the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone. Sternothyroid, from the sternum to the thyroid cartilage. The devil is in the details. Okay, and that wraps up the neck, and we'll keep going with the back and the thorax.